to this. The meeting is being recorded. Welcome everyone to this week's CCPR seminar. My name is Andres Villarreal. I'll be introducing the speaker and moderating today's event. And before starting, I just want to go over the procedure for remote presentations. Like Don was saying, the people can interrupt and ask questions throughout the presentation. And I think the procedure we followed is that people should try to remain muted. And then if you have a question during the presentation, simply unmute yourself and ask the question. I'll try to monitor the chat as well, but it's easier if everyone just simply speaks up. And then there's plenty of time at the end of the presentation to ask questions, and we'll follow the same procedure where people unmute themselves and ask. If we have many questions, then we can start a queue through the chat, and I'll monitor that. So with all that in mind, I want to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is David Brady. He's professor of the School of Public Policy and director of the Bloom Initiative on Global and Regional Poverty at the University of California, Riverside. Before joining the Department of Riverside, he was the director of the Inequality and Social Policy Department at the Berlin Social Science Center, where he remains a fellow. He's the author of Rich Democracies, Poor People, and numerous articles in all the top journals. I think it's fair to say David is one of the foremost experts on the topics of poverty and inequality in the country. In recent studies, he has been examining deep and extreme poverty and the risks of child poverty in the US. His presentation today is titled Prevalences, Penalties, and the Small Impact of Single Motherhood on America's High Child Poverty. All right, David? David, over to you. Is he on?
I think he may have lost connection.
He feared that would happen. Maybe he'll rejoin us. He was just mentioning he was afraid of his connection. You can see where it pops up, right?
Yeah, I'm not seeing him. I do have his slides available. He did email them to me prior to the presentation. So let's see if he's able to join and share his slides. Otherwise, I can go ahead and project them. It might help with the connection.
Yeah, I think he said he could try it on the cell phone and then maybe the slides.
Sorry about that. I don't know what's going on, that my laptop just suddenly lost the connection. And I really apologize, but I'll try my best here. Okay, so let's just start. Okay, so now I'm back again, I think. Let me get back on the mainframe here. Sorry about that. Okay, so I can say a few things while I talk. So first, let me just say this piece is collaborative with Regina Baker and Ryan Finnegan, two former PhD students of mine who are really terrific. And if nothing else, it's really great to use this paper as a way to spend more time with them. Regina is here. You can say hello, Regina, if you're here. But Ryan is teaching right now, and so could not be here during the presentation. And I want to mention as well, and I'm just about to connect here. Let me Zoom link in. And I want to mention that Regina is actually the first author on this paper. And okay, I'm being connected on the other one. So let me go to the other one here and mute this one.
We can't see your slides. We can't hear you, or at least I can't.
No, you're muted now.
David, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, let me. Okay, so I'm back. And let me turn this one off at least. Okay, sorry, I apologize. And so like I was saying, the paper, Regina is actually the first author in this paper, and it's important to note that. But the one thing I'll say is that I thought this was a paper. I need to have the host enable me to share the screen real quick. one thing I'll say is I thought this is a paper that would be very useful for this audience to give us some feedback on, and I thought it'd be highly relevant given the topic of the paper and the expertise in demography in this group. So let's start there. Okay, so now this paper was in part started because a couple of years ago, Ryan, Sabina Hupkin, and I wrote a piece in the New York Times where we talked about a recent American Journal of Sociology article that we had written. And in that piece, we argued that single motherhood is actually a very small part of the problem of poverty in America. We specifically talk about the fact that even if there was much lower single motherhood in the United States, poverty would only decline by a very, very small amount. And that poverty really can't be explained very well in the United States by the phenomenon of single motherhood. This piece largely argued that, US poverty would actually be higher if the United States had the cross-national median or 1970 prevalences of what we call the 4 major risks of poverty. And so the argument is basically that if you reduce the prevalence of risks, including especially single motherhood, you can't get the United States to low poverty. You can't accomplish low poverty. Hence, single mothers are not the problem. This piece was highly controversial, and there was a number of conservative outlets that attacked the piece. So Brad Wilcox wrote in the National Review actually pieces where he said, sorry, New York Times, for child poverty, family structure still matters. Kay Himowitz with the right-wing Manhattan Institute wrote in the City Journal, she called us family breakdown denialists, which I actually like as a label because I do deny there's a family breakdown. Bob Samuelson, in his nationally syndicated column, he called me up and tried to interview me and get me to say something embarrassing, but he argued that don't deny the link between poverty and single motherhood, and drew a lot of right-wing traffic our way. And the argument that emerged engaging with these folks was that, okay, maybe you have something with regards to poverty overall, but surely single motherhood explains why the United States has high child poverty. So if we focus on children, the influence of single motherhood surely must be important. And so what we're doing here, in part, much more broadly motivated than that, but in part, we're interested in sort of revisiting our 2017 AJS paper and asking how much lower would US child poverty in particular be with a lower prevalence of single motherhood. So unlike that piece, we focus much more on single motherhood and we focus specifically on child poverty. So what we're going to do here today is just do a couple things. First, we're going to apply our prevalences and penalties framework to analyze this issue, and I'll talk about what that means in a moment. Okay, we're going to analyze both this data, Luxembourg Income Study data, across 30 rich democracies, but we're also, unlike the AJS article, going to scrutinize the United States over time and within the US from the 1970s to 2016. And then ultimately what we're going to do is we're going to simulate what poverty rates would be with lower counterfactual prevalences. So what if we did lower the prevalence of single motherhood? Now, just by way of background, there's a number of studies that are quite relevant. There's a big literature on this topic. And I want to be clear that this literature often uses strong causal language to argue that single motherhood, in fact, causes America's high child poverty. So for example, David Elwood and Christopher Jenks told us that those whose primary goal is to reduce child poverty should mainly worry about the increased proportion of children living with only one adult. Paul Amato and Rebecca Maynard wrote, a major cause of the rise of child poverty in the United States during the second half of the 20th century is the decline of married couple households. And finally, in 2015, the American Enterprise Institute, which is a right-wing think tank, and the Brookings Institution, which is a centrist think tank, formed a quote-unquote bipartisan consensus committee that brought a number of people together, including many extremely influential and highly visible poverty scholars. And in this consensus plan, they came together and tried to propose what they thought was something we could all agree on how to reduce child poverty and upward mobility, or increased mobility. And the very first recommendation in the plan was that we need to promote a new cultural norm surrounding parenthood and marriage. Okay. Now, beyond these strong claims, there's also a much broader literature that's relevant here as well. Okay. For example, much of the concern with what Garfinkel and McClanahan called the new American dilemma was about the rise of single motherhood and what this meant for children. Single motherhood and its implications for children is very closely linked with a huge literature in the sociology of family that looks at the fundamental transformation of the American family and the various new family forms that are emerging. The focus on single mother and child poverty also motivates extensive research on why and how single mother households are formed. So for example, Bain and Elwood wrote in their 94 book, which was very much the intellectual blueprint for the 96 welfare reform, they told us because single parent families are formed. If we could prevent the formation of single parent families, we could largely eliminate the need for AFDC, which is aid to families with dependent children. I would also argue that single motherhood is the best example of the now and still dominant behavioral theories of poverty, which I wrote about in a 2019 annual review of sociology essay about poverty. In a demography piece in 2012, we argued that single motherhood is probably the most well-studied correlate of poverty. And so this represents a huge tradition of literature that's interested in single motherhood as a predictor and indeed a cause of poverty. Now, beyond that, there's been a number of studies in highly influential journals, ASR, leading economist journals. Thomas and Sawhill was in Journal of Policy Analysis and Management. Sarah McLennan has written a whole number of papers on this, where they do decompositions, and we'll talk about what that's involved, where they show simply that high and rising single motherhood can in fact explain high and rising child poverty here in the United States. And just one example of this in her popular book, which translated some of the scholarship, Isabel Sawhill wrote that if we could turn back the marriage clock to 1970, before the sharp rise in divorce and single parenthood began, the child poverty rate would be 20% lower than it is now. Even if some of our biggest social programs like food stamps do not poverty as much as unmarried parenthood has increased it. Now, I'll set aside whether or not the institution of marriage in 1970 was so great for women. I'll also set aside, it's never been quite clear how she comes with these estimates of 20%, but we very much want to embrace this on its empirical grounds and debate what they find. So let's discuss this now. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to apply some of the thinking that we developed in our 2017 AJS piece, what we come to call the prevalences and penalties framework. And the idea very, very simply is to say, let's think about these major risks of poverty and let's break them into two components, the prevalences and the penalties. And it's specifically a framework that we use to scrutinize what we call the four major risks of poverty. And those four major risks are unemployment, low education, young headship, and single motherhood. And we use very, very classic and very simple demographic decomposition. And what we do that's a little different is we try to inject a bit more substance to that, naming and labeling the components that we often know as the endowments and the coefficients components. And we just want to do classic and simple comparisons where we describe a bit more thoroughly about what each of these components are. And in the process, do what we think are the right comparisons to be able to make a sort of substantive understanding. So we very much view our work here as entirely standing on the shoulders of demography giants in this regard. Okay. Now, beyond that, let's sort of talk about the two components. The prevalences component is simply the share of the population with a poverty increasing characteristic. So very simply, the population weighted share of the population, how many children live in single mother households. Now, if we're focused on the prevalences component, or what demographers often know, the endowments components, you're really focused on behavioral explanations of poverty. The goal is to reduce the prevalences, and if you do so, you're going to have less poverty. Prevalences have gotten far more attention in the poverty literature, but as we argued in the 2017 piece, they don't seem to explain America's high poverty in general, okay? By contrast is that what we call the penalties component, and that's simply the increased probability of poverty that's associated with a given demographic risk. So for example, what's the coefficient on single motherhood in a model predicting poverty? And if you're interested in the penalties components, we argue, and we've argued, that these are to a certain extent manipulable by policy and politics. And so therefore, you're more interested in the political theory of poverty. And again, in my 2019 annual review piece, we talk about the major theories of poverty. I would sort of put these things in these buckets. Now, what we've argued in the 2017 piece is what's really most noticeable is that the United States doesn't have a particularly high prevalence of the major risks of poverty. In fact, the US is below average on the prevalences of major risks. By contrast, the US has by far the highest penalties of these risks of poverty. So the US doesn't stand out for having a lot of people in risk categories. The US stands out for punishing people in those risk categories much more severely than any other rich democracy does. And we showed this in the 2017 piece. So if you're informed by this prevalence and penalties framework, I would argue that there's a number of questions we should be asking about prior research on the topic. So applying this approach, we come up with 4 major issues I would focus upon. First of all, the prior research is mainly focused on unconditional differences between married and single mother households. Okay, but of course, we all know that single mothers are disadvantaged in terms of education, employment, and age relative to couples. Indeed, McClanahan's diverging destiny thesis and the assorted mating literature, including work done by Jenny Brand and others, contend that single mothers are adversely selected, such that single motherhood selects upon and exacerbates pre-existing social class disadvantages. To correctly estimate how much lower prevalence of single motherhood would actually reduce child poverty, it's essential to penalty for child poverty conditional on other risks and predictors of poverty. Okay. Secondly, there's a striking lack of comparison between the single motherhood risk and the single motherhood penalty in this prior research and the penalty 3 other risks of poverty. Now, in our work, we've shown that single motherhood has the important risk of the 4 major risks. The effect of unemployment or low education, for example, is dramatically more consequential to poverty than single motherhood. Regina, in a very nice journal, Marriage and Family, 15 shows that the penalty for single motherhood has declined dramatically over time for children specific.
It seems Dr. Brady has frozen. Maybe we can.
I'm sorry? Maybe he'll rejoin. Maybe he can rejoin again.
Let me go ahead and resend him the invitation. Maybe he can call in.
Yes, since Esmeralda has the copies of the PowerPoints, if he just gets audio, we could probably do it. Now might be a good time for advertisement for upcoming events. If anybody has some, Jenny.
Okay. I'm so very sorry, everybody. I don't know what's going on. I have Wi-Fi. I don't know what's going on. I really apologize. And I don't know what to say. If I could be enabled to share this screen, I'll pick back up where I was.
Absolutely. I wonder if it might also help if you turn off your video. I know it's not ideal, but it might help a bit.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I just get disconnected from the Wi-Fi and I don't know why it's going on. I don't know what's up. So anyway, I'll leave this one on over here. I have a second one on and I'll switch to that if I have to. I'm so sorry. Okay, so let's go back to where we were. Hopefully I can pick up right here. Okay, so first major issue was the focus on raw unconditional differences. The second issue is the lack of comparison with other penalties. Okay, third, like I was saying, in this literature, at least implicitly, if not explicitly, there's a presumption that the United States has a high and increasing prevalence of single motherhood. But in our 2017 article, we showed that only 8.8% of people in working age households in the United States are actually in single mother households. And so modest share of the entire US population are the people at risk of poverty. And moreover, it's been surprisingly stable over time. And when you compare the United States to other rich democracies, as Hewlin and Weinchecker did in their demography piece, you find that family structure isn't likely to explain the cross-national differences in child poverty. So we would challenge this presumption that there's actually a high prevalence of single motherhood amongst American children. And fourth and finally, there are strengths and weaknesses to focusing on the US case. The US case is interesting, but it's also extremely unusual. And the US case is not terribly representative of most rich democracies. And like we said, the US has a distinctively high penalty for single motherhood. So this could mean one of two things. It could be the US case is very weird and comparisons with other countries changes our understanding somehow. Or it could be that this high penalty means single motherhood actually does matter in the United States, and the consequences could be more influential here in the US than elsewhere, okay? So let's move on to the methods. And at least I make up for being then by talking really fast during the times I'm talking. So let me know if you have questions. Okay, so what we're gonna do, here's the basic game plan. We're gonna analyze data on 30 high-income countries with the Luxembourg Income Study, and we're gonna focus specifically on children under 18 that are nested in households. Our samples range from a couple thousand upwards of over 100,000 for different countries, and that's just the availability of census-like data for these different countries. In the United States, we have samples around 50,000 for every year that we analyze. And if you wanna know, it's the US CPS ASEC data. So basically what the list does is it takes the CPS ASEC in March and then it and does what they call lissify to the data to make some tweaks and cleanings and include some better income data. Now,
you're frozen again.
I think he said he was going to leave his other computer on. Is his other connection also gone? Yeah.
I don't see him logged in a second on a second device. Oh wait, there is a second device, but there's no audio with that device. I can go ahead and share the slides if he calls in. I'm okay with doing that as well. I'm not sure if he's comfortable with that, but I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, I mean, that's like somebody who's giving a presentation and says, next slide, please.
Yeah.
And maybe let's try to set it up that way.
Yeah, I think he said he could even call in on his phone if necessary. Esmeralda, are you getting any requests from him to join? No.
Yes, I admitted him. I see him here. I'm not sure. Dr. Brady, can you hear us?
Okay, sorry about that, guys. I'm trying again here. I don't know what's going on. I'll just keep trying. Okay, if Esmeralda, if you can show share screen possibly with my slides, I can talk through this at least through the phone, and I'll try just to see if I can connect while I do this. Okay.
Absolutely. Let me go ahead and share my screen and make sure that the slides, that you all can see the slides.
Okay. I'm not sure if I'm the worst performer here in terms of the internet connection, but end the year with something interesting, right? Let's give it a shot. Yeah. Okay, so let's go to the method slide, and I'll just talk you through it. And I'll ask Esmeralda to forward the slides. Go ahead. Okay, so I was starting to say the way the list works is that it's housed at a server in Luxembourg. And what you do is you interact through, this is good right here. You interact through a web-based interface or through email, and you send in code using Stata or SAS or R or any software. And so if somebody has your code, they should be able to replicate your entire paper. And I wanted to say that I can share my code with people if they're interested in this offline, and you can see exactly how we did it. Okay, all right, now the key advantage, the reason we use the list is that it gives us this higher quality measures of household income. So one of the really nice features that list has added in taxes and tax credits and transfers. And so you get a measure of household income is that it's much more realistic and much more accurate measure of household income. It's more valid, more reliable. And we equivalize by the square root of the number of household members to adjust for household size. You can go to the next slide, Esmeralda. Okay, so now, prior research in this literature overwhelmingly uses the official poverty measure. And I would argue very unequivocally that the official poverty measure is terrible, it's invalid, it's unreliable. I'd give the specific example that when we're looking especially at single mother families, it's crucial that we've evolved from a set of social policies like aid to families with dependent children to temporary assistance for needy families, which is included in the official poverty measure. And those policies have declined dramatically. TANF is a very, very small policy. It affects relatively small shares of even single mother families these days. By contrast, we've massively expanded the ITC, SNAP, and the child tax credit. And those policies, which are far more influential in low-income families, and especially for low-income single mothers, those policies are completely omitted by the official poverty measure. And one way to think about this is most of what we've done to attack poverty during the pandemic, like stimulus payments and the recent expansion of the child tax credit, are completely ignored by the official poverty measure. So instead, we're going to use a poverty measure that's very standard in the international literature, which is less than 50% of the median household equivalized disposable household income. And like I said, this is a standard measure that's very, very typical in the international poverty literature. And this is a big difference from prior research in this field, which has tended to rely on the OPM, which we argue is quite bad. Okay, next, if you can move on, there is how we measure single motherhood. And the way we do this is we're going to look at households that are headed by unmarried or unpartnered women who reside with her own children. And we define heads a little bit more differently than just the definition that's used by the census. Instead, what we do is we identify the highest earning person in the household. And then if there are multiple people that are higher earners in the household, we break the tie by using age, and then we randomly choose the head of household beyond that, but that only applies to a few. We code cohabitors as partnered households, so they are not part of the single motherhood group. Okay, and I can talk in the Q&A later on that we try other ways to measure single motherhood, and it doesn't really change any of the conclusions. And in fact, if I can take some questions on this right now, because it's often a source of uncertainty in the paper, but I would say that it really doesn't change the conclusions. And regardless of how we do it, you end up with basically the same results. So I don't know if anyone has any questions about how we measure single motherhood specifically. Not sure. Or okay, I assume I haven't seen any. Okay, so let's move on a little bit further. Okay, so we define the prevalences very simply as the population weighted percent of the population with a given risk. So that's very, very simple and straightforward to define. Okay, we also should describe how we measure the three other major risks: a young headed household, is one in which the head of the household is under 25 years old. Low education is defined as those households where the head of the household has less than a high school degree. And unemployed households are really non-employed households. These are households where there are zero earners in the past year. So for all of the estimates of penalties, we're going to include the following cross-national controls regarding age, family structure, education, and employment dynamics, as well as family composition. In the US specific analyses, we have a few more control variables we can bring in. We include whether or not there's a single father household as opposed to the reference couple. We include binary categories for the major racial and ethnic groups within the data. And then within the Latino subsample, we do some work, especially with immigrant non-citizen heads in some sensitivity analyses as well. Okay, so let's move on to the penalties.
David, could I?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Could I ask you, are you going to later in your talk explain the way that that your differences in definition have created differences in your outcomes? That's
so the definition of single motherhood?
Yeah, I mean all of these things, and particularly partnered.
Okay.
Versus single motherhood. Yeah, single motherhood versus partnerhood, and partnered and the difference in the poverty definition and so on. It would be helpful if we knew how each of those things affected your difference in conclusions.
Yeah, so on the single motherhood one, it really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I can show you a slide at the very end of the talk where we fiddle with it and try several different alternatives. It does not change any of the conclusions. There's tiny differences in the point estimates. You can get a more substantial difference in the prevalences of single motherhood. If you look only at lone mothers versus other definitions of single motherhood, it cuts it in about half. But even then, it's going to undermine rather than augment the case for single motherhood mattering, okay? So single motherhood definitions really are not going to matter. On the poverty definitions, we didn't do the analysis with the OPM. You can't do that with our definition of income. So one of the fundamental problems of the OPM is the way it measures income is arbitrary and deeply flawed. And so there's no point in applying the OPM thresholds to this definition of income. So we don't do that. In other analyses, we fiddled with it. We could put the threshold at 40% of the median income, 60% of the median income. I've done several dozen papers with this sort of threshold. It never matters. It just doesn't matter. So you can get tiny, tiny little fluctuations in point estimates, but it just does not matter. The basic set of control variables that we include has kind of been worked out over time in the poverty literature. There just isn't much controversy on what should be in a poverty model. We've kind of worked this out. It's pretty stable by this point in time. So you can, we could fiddle around with the age function, for example. You could get fancier with that, but it really doesn't change your story. You could, do some sort of polynomial. You could do 5-year age groupings. It's just not going to change the story. And as you'll see in the models, the coefficients are almost always highly significant because we have 50,000 cases just in the US alone. And so is there one that you're curious about in particular? Sure, I can talk about that, but I can just assure you it doesn't change the story.
Okay, so you're going to tell us that the story is that it's all penalty, and I mean you told us that before, but that's where you're going to end up also. It's not prevalence, it's penalty. and tinkering with the definitions of prevalence don't matter.
That's correct. Now there's one in the very next slide. There's one more controversial piece that I do want to talk about where the story gets a little bit more complicated. So I'll get there. Okay, so first, let's just talk about the penalties as they're estimated. So what we do is we estimate logit models. Okay, so you're running the analysis on each country year separately with population weights. You cluster standard errors at the household level, nothing fancy there. I would prefer to do these with linear probability models. They have one advantage we talked about in the AGS article is that it makes your penalties comparable, conditional, and concordant, but life is just too short to argue with sociological reviewers about the merits of logit versus linear probability models. So we just fold over and do logit in this particular paper. And when you're estimating counterfactual prevalences, it doesn't matter. It does matter when you estimate counterfactual penalties, but that's in the weeds. And the basic setup we're doing here is a series of counterfactual simulations. So we predict poverty with a model. Then what we do is we randomly reassign children from single mother to coupled households up to a counterfactual prevalence. Okay, so we say if we want to cut the prevalence in half, we would randomly reassign rather than having 20% of the kids in single mother households, let's put 10% of those, randomly reassign them to couple households. We then predict poverty with that counterfactual prevalence. So very, very straightforward setup. We tried it other ways. Ryan went and did 4 alternative random reassignments. We did it 5 different ways, and the results were identical. If you do just simply use the state of margins command, use predicted probabilities, what you're doing there is you're kind of thinking of like the average respondent who has a proportion of themselves that is single mother, and you're changing that average respondent's proportion single mother. And that's a bit less intuitive, but your results are almost completely identical if you just use that sort of regression-based framework rather than actually manually reassigning people to couple households. Okay, now, as you all know, and there's plenty of smart people that can talk about this, this is obviously not causal, okay? We have a regression model with cross-sectional data at one point in time, and we're looking at just what predicts poverty in this cross-sectional model. Of course, this is not causal. So we have 2 things we want to think about this. Now, one, and arguably the bigger threat, is that we might have post-treatment bias. So if the other risk factors are mediating and not simply confounded with single motherhood, well, then by including those other risk factors, we might be blocking the causal pathway between single motherhood and poverty. And that then would lead to an underestimation of the single motherhood penalty, which would then affect our simulation. So to Don's question, regardless of whether it's prevalences or penalties, doesn't always matter, because when you do the simulations, if the penalties are really big, but there's a small prevalence, you still could really move the needle on poverty by reducing that prevalence of poverty, okay? So that could matter. I'm gonna talk about that in depth later in the talk. So I'm gonna give that its own treatment in the talk. Now, another thing we could do to say, well, okay, we know we can't do this causally, and there's absolutely no way in cross-sectional data on 30 countries and over 20 different time points to get a reliable causal estimate of the single motherhood penalty in all these cases. So what we did as a way to sort of benchmark our estimates was we went into the PSID and we used the PSID-CNEF, which is the cross-national equivalent file, which gives you better income data. And we compared our penalties in the Luxembourg Income Study to penalties that you would get with 2-way fixed effects models and panel data. And I can show you those now. So if you go to the next slide, please, Esmeralda. Okay, so here in the first column, I'm going to show you, this is a preview of what you're going to see later, is the penalties you get or the coefficients on these key 4 risk factors in the list in the first left column, okay? And so, for example, the probability of poverty for a child increases by about 9.47 percentage points if you are in a single mother household versus the reference group. And then the next 2 models are where we use 2-way fixed effects models with a logit model and 2-way fixed effects models with linear probability. And you see that the penalty is only marginally bigger in these 2-way fixed effects models. And so in that sense, even if you include 2-way fixed effects, right, which arguably is a more quote unquote causal estimate, you're going to get a penalty estimate for single motherhood that's quite similar to what you get in the cross-sectional data, just only a little bit bigger. And later in the talk, you'll see that it really wouldn't change any of our conclusions, even if you adopted the highest of those penalties. So that gives us some confidence that our estimates of the penalties are not out of the ballpark. They're not wildly wrong. And I can talk more about that if people have questions about that. I saw a question pop up in the Q&A, I think from Victor. Go ahead and just ask it out loud, Victor, if you can. Or no? Okay.
Yes. Hi, I'm sorry. That's probably not, I put it in the chat because may not be the right question that's this time. I'm just curious how you account for marital trajectories or partnership trajectories, like single motherhood from start versus as a result of...
Right, we do not account for it. So we only have cross-sectional data and we don't do anything with the marital histories. I think the CPS might have some information on that, but we don't do anything with it. So we treat all single mothers the same, regardless of whether they got there through an out-of-wedlock birth or whether they got there through divorce. We don't distinguish between that. Some of that you could argue, you may not be persuaded, that we're addressing that partly through controls because we're controlling for education, employment, other factors like that. But no, we do not treat them differently.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry I interrupted you. Thanks.
No, no worries at all. Welcome. Okay, so this is the idea: is that I'm sorry. I'd be curious to hear. Oh, go ahead, Don.
I'm sorry to interrupt you again.
No.
But if you did treat them separately, can you conjecture as to what their effects would be?
Well, let's think about this. I mean, I'm going to purely unsubstantiated conjecture. Give me license for that for a second.
Yes.
I would say I don't think they're going to be meaningfully different net of all the other observables. Okay, so do I think that there's other, out of wedlock birth, those mothers are disadvantaged in ways that divorced mothers are not, right? But, aside from education, employment, age, and all these other characteristics of the households, I don't think that's going to move the needle too much on the coefficients being really, really different, but that's totally unsubstantiated. What I would suggest, so do we believe that if we had two penalties, one for having come from an out of wedlock birth and being a single mother household today, one coming from a divorced household and being a single mother today, both against the reference group, I don't believe they'd be different, but I can't prove it. And we can't test it with the CPS. We could do it with the PSID, but we haven't. Yeah, so that's admittedly I don't know if somebody feels strongly otherwise. I would be curious. We can't do anything about it in the CPS, but we could try it in the PSID, so it's not out of bounds. But so this is one of the conjectures that I'm making here, is that this PSID estimates give us at least a credible baseline of what the penalty might be under a more quote unquote causal specification. And that gives us a basis from guessing that our cross-sectional estimates are reasonable. Okay. And like I said, even if you use like the PSID logit estimate there, it wouldn't change our story. You'll see later on, it doesn't change our story. Okay.
What fraction of your single mothers are divorced versus out of wedlock? You know?
I don't know offhand. I don't know. We can find out, but I don't have it in my head. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, it's the CPS in 2016 is what you're looking at right here. So if somebody happens to know just off their top of their head what the proportions are in the US right now, that's what we've got. Nationally representative data with weights and so forth. Okay. So let's go forward just a little bit further and let's look at the one. Yeah, go ahead, Jenny.
I know you're going to talk about the post-treatment bias later, but I'm just wondering how, conceptually, how much you're thinking of these penalties as separate versus overlapping, and to what degree, single motherhood kind of instigates a lot of the other penalties, low education, unemployment, and so forth.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it's probably best to put it off to that point in the talk, because that's something I want to give deliberate attention to. But we do, to answer your question directly, we treat them as separate and additive penalties. So that has strengths and weaknesses, okay? All right. And we could do something with compounding risks. And we've thought about this, but we fiddled around with it. I don't know if you remember, Regina, we did something with this early on and then we decided to abandon that. But to answer Jane's question, I'll have to get to just go to that a little bit later on. Okay, so let's go to the next slide and just talk about very simply and descriptively. And like I said, we want to use very classic and simple demographic decomposition to do a lot of descriptive work in this talk. We want to just describe the patterns and make very simple comparisons. Okay, so first let's just look at levels and trends in child poverty. And as you can see, first in the left, you can see that the United States has a high rate of child poverty. About 21% of American kids are in poverty, and this is quite high. A couple countries in recent years, Israel and Spain in particular, have surged ahead of the United States and now have higher child poverty than the United States. The US is the third highest, but it's not significantly different from Italy, which has a smaller sample and bigger confidence intervals around that point estimates. So the US is third highest, but it's not significantly higher than Italy. Okay, and on the right, you can see that what's most distinctive about American child poverty isn't only that it's high, it's that it's basically always been high. And so I always say that the most pronounced trend in poverty in the United States is stability at a high level. And that's the case for child poverty as well. Back to the 1970s, when we first have data here, we find that child poverty has always been quite high, especially compared to other countries, but it's been remarkably stable over time. If anything, it's declined a bit since the 1980s. Okay, it's declined a little bit since the 80s, but it's still quite high. Okay, move to the next slide. All right, so next we want to just describe the cross-national variation in the prevalences and the penalties. And let's just animate this slowly, if I can, and say, first, let's look at just the prevalence of single motherhood amongst children in 30 rich democracies and advance just a little bit. Esmeralda, thank you. Okay, and what you can see here is you see the prevalence is across the 30 rich democracies, and there's point estimates, confidence intervals around it, and the vertical line shows you where the United States sits. And so animate just a little further. And as you can see, just go one, there we go, thank you. The US has the 7th highest prevalence of single motherhood amongst the 30 rich democracies, and about 20% of kids are in single mother households, okay? And so the US is fairly high. It's not the highest, it's not way above average, but it's fairly high. It's above average in the prevalence of single motherhood. But what's more noticeable is that almost every country has a fairly high prevalence of single motherhood, okay? There's a few countries at the bottom of the distribution that have very low prevalences, but a fairly high prevalence is fairly typical. The median country has 14.4% of its children in single mother households. And by the mid-2010s, like we have now, single motherhood is prevalent in almost all the rich democracies to a certain extent, and a fairly high prevalence is typical and common in this sense. So one step further, okay, we can see now the penalties, and these are the coefficients on the single motherhood variable within each of these country year analyses run separately. And again, there are confidence intervals on those coefficients, and slide just a little bit forward, okay? That you can see that what really stands out here is that the United States has the highest penalty. So the US is above average in the prevalence, but a high prevalence is fairly common, even typical across rich democracies. But what's unusual here is the US has an extremely high penalty for being in a single mother household. So if you're in a single mother household in the United States for children, it increased your probability of poverty by about 10 percentage points. Now, also, there's far more variation across countries in the penalty. So whereas every country, not every country, most countries have a fairly high prevalence of single motherhood, most countries have almost no penalty for single motherhood. In 23 of the 30 rich democracies, the coefficient on single motherhood is not significantly positive. So in most countries, there's no significant penalty attached to single motherhood for child poverty. The median country has a penalty of only 1.1 percentage points, which shows you that the US penalty for child poverty is for single motherhood is about 10 times greater than it is in other countries. Okay, so that's what's distinctive is the US has a very high penalty. Now, going forward one slide, we look at the, oh, please go ahead.
Hi, this is Adriana Gerasmini. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
I wanted to ask a quick question about your previous slide.
Okay.
You know, I think you're doing the best you can do with this data, and I know you're interested in poverty, but I'm really curious if you've done a similar analysis where you estimate the penalties on some other measure of a child outcome that is maybe not subject to so many issues about comparability, you know, because of the issues with the poverty rate are, you know, there's so much controversy over how to measure it and compare it across countries and stuff like that. If you looked at something like child height or, you know, some other outcome, would you find the same thing that you're like, would the countries rank the same in terms of penalty? You know what I mean?
I'm not sure. I don't really agree with the premise of the question. I'm sorry, I don't agree that there's so much controversy on how to measure child poverty. Maybe you could expand on that, but I've been working on that for a really long time. And I actually think we have a lot of consensus in the international poverty literature. We have tremendous evidence and theory to justify a relative measure of poverty. So I actually don't agree with the premise of the question. I do think we have very good ways to measure poverty. And I actually think that's probably one of the better measures we've got for a cross-national comparison. To answer your question though, no, we're only interested in poverty. I'm not making a claim at all about the other consequences for children's well-being. That's beyond our scope. So I would both say that it is a good measure, and secondly say, no, it's beyond our scope to look at other outcomes. Is there a concern with the measure of poverty that you're aware of that I'm not aware of? Because that would be a surprise to me.
Well, I mean, there are arguments in the US about what, you know, how to measure income, what counts as income, what has happened to deep poverty or whatever. You know, there are some economists who don't think that these trends are correct. I mean, I'm not an expert, I defer to you. I was just wondering whether there was some other outcomes that one could look at and whether they would show the same, and that would boost your case.
Yeah, and I would totally welcome that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would totally welcome that. And I think that would be interesting. That's, I have a very, I guess, narrow or focused interest in poverty specifically. I'm only interested in poverty for this paper. If single motherhood has consequences on other outcomes, that's certainly a good empirical question, but that's beyond my scope and expertise. But I actually think we have really good ways. I would say one of the greatest and most productive international literatures that really has achieved consensus is international income literature. It's terrific. We've made tremendous progress. And the whole point of the Luxembourg Income Study is to institutionalize that progress, going back to the United Nations Canberra group. So I actually feel very good about what we do with income. There's survey underreporting, there's challenges with any income measure, but I actually think we're in much better shape on income than we are on many topics. Andreas, for example, knows our measurement of income is dramatically ahead of our measurement of wealth. And so I believe firmly in this measure of poverty. But if there's critiques, I'd be happy to hear them. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on a little bit and talk about the variation. So right here, one of the punchlines that we've had is that, pretty much every country has some share of its population engaged in poverty increasing risks. And here I show you just very simply descriptively the prevalences across these 30 rich democracies in these 4 risks. And this is the coefficient of variation, very simple measure of how much heterogeneity there is across countries. And you can see right here that there's very little heterogeneity across countries in these risks, and single motherhood is like that. Now, if you animate just a little bit further, okay, you can see that by contrast, the cross-national variation in penalties is gigantic. There's much bigger variation in how much countries penalize risks and much less variation in how much variation there is in the prevalence of risks. For example, there's about 5 times as much variation in how much countries choose to penalize single motherhood than there is in the prevalence of single motherhood across rich democracies. So every country has some share of its population in risk categories, but countries differ quite dramatically in how much they punish people for these risk categories. So we can go forward one slide. Okay, so now we can also look just descriptively, and like I want to argue is that this descriptive comparison I hope is useful, is that the within US historical variation in prevalence and penalties is also quite informative. Okay, and let's look at this over time. So first, going on one slide, here we see the trends in the prevalences of the 4 major risks of child poverty from 1979 to 2016. And you can see that in recent decades, in fact, single motherhood has been the most prevalent risks of the 4 risks, okay? And in that sense, you could say, well, this suggests that if we reduce single motherhood, child poverty would decline substantially. But as you can see over time, that a large part of what's gone on isn't so much that single motherhood is dramatically increased. It's really a story that the other risks of child poverty, especially low education, have declined dramatically. So back in 1979, more than a quarter of children resided in households where the head of the household did not have a high school degree. And by 2016, this is closer to 10%. And you can see there's been steady, if not declining, rate prevalences of children in unemployed or young-headed households. And at the same time, single motherhood hasn't really increased that much, especially since the 80s, but it's been fairly stable rather than increasing. So there's mixed evidence from looking at the prevalences over time. If you look at the penalties next, you can see that. Oh, go ahead, please. Yeah.
What has been happening with SIBSHIP size within each of these measures? So like has SIBSHIP size in single mother households stayed constant over time, or things like that?
Yeah, I don't know offhand. I know we control for it. So we just treat it as a control. So we have 2 controls that would bear on SIBSHIP side. One is there's simply the number of kids. We also control for the number of elders in the household, because that's actually one way to reduce poverty. And then we include a binary measure of whether or not, and I can't remember if we did it in this analysis, but whether or not there's a child under 5 in the household. And so we control for it, but I haven't looked at it descriptively. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, so that single motherhood penalty that you're going to see in the very next slide, if you go ahead, is net of SIBSHIP size.
I'm sorry, can I ask one question on the last slide? Just thinking about low education and, comparing 1970 to 2020.
Yeah.
So low education, the measure remains stable, right, at less than high school? I'm
Correct.
just wondering, over those 50 years, if we should be thinking about low education as shifting over time as more people have more education, you know, whether we should be thinking about high school graduates or as falling into more of that low education category rather than keeping it stable. I think you're muted now.
Okay, sorry. It was if we didn't have enough tech problems already. We don't do that here. We could do that. I mean, I've seen a few people that use a relative measure of education. So you could use like the bottom third of the percentiles, the middle third and the top third. You could do something like that. You could do more binary categories. They use basically the ISCED classifications, what they do across countries. So we could do that. I haven't done that. I don't know if it matters, but I'm open to it. So I haven't done anything with it yet. Okay, yeah. Okay, so if we go forward one slide, we can see that the penalties are very interesting as well. And so at least since the early 1990s, the single motherhood penalty has been the smallest penalty of the four major risks. Okay, so the probability of poverty increases the least for the risk of single motherhood than it does for the other risks. Okay, so even though the prevalence of single motherhood is the most common risk within the United States, the penalty is actually the smallest penalty, okay? Now further, beyond that, one of the things that's really important to recognize is not only is the penalty for young headship and low education much more influential than the penalty for single motherhood, but the penalty for unemployment is dramatically bigger in the cross-sectional analysis, okay? So employment is by far the most important predictor of poverty, which might not be surprising, but you'll see in just a moment how that might bear on the results in that sense, okay? So certainly single motherhood matters, but it's the least relevant consequence. So now let's go to the simulations. Okay, go one slide forward. And here what we're going to do is those simulations that I talk about, and I'll be able to walk you through those. So go on to the next one and just animate one slide. Okay, so first thing we do is we animate just a little bit further. Okay, first we estimate the model, okay, and we find that we can predict, the predicted values are very similar to actual values, right? And so recall about 21.28% of children in America are poor, and this is the third highest child poverty rate. Okay, animate further. If we turn the clock back to 1970, or use the cross-national median prevalence of risks, the United States declines very, very little. It goes from 21.3 to 20.1% poor. And this pushes the United States to the fourth highest rate of child poverty. So it goes only from the third to the fourth if the US turned back the clock to 1970 or had the cross-national median prevalence of single motherhood. And in those two estimates, the US remains statistically indistinguishable from Italy. Okay, the last one, you animate just a little bit further. If the US had zero single motherhood, child poverty would only decline to 18.8%, and the US would have significantly lower child poverty than Italy. So if the US had no single motherhood at all, child poverty in the United States would only be lower than Italy. That's all that would change. The US would still have very high child poverty. As we note at the bottom of this figure, the child poverty average rate across rich democracies is about 11.5%. So even if the US had no single motherhood, the simulation says that the US would still have very, very high child poverty and would only fall below Italy, okay? So questions about how we do those simulations before I move on? Okay, all right, so let's slide forward one more. Okay, so now one of the concerns that we talk about in the paper is that if you highlight the first line there, the prevalence of single motherhood in African-American and Latino households is much, much higher. And some have argued that surely if you reduce single motherhood amongst African-Americans and Latinos, this would make a difference to the child poverty rates for those groups in particular. So even if we don't find overall that reducing single motherhood would reduce child poverty, maybe for African-Americans and Latinos, the difference would matter. And the top line shows you that indeed, in fact, it's the case. There is a much higher prevalence of single motherhood amongst African-American and Latino children. So roughly almost half of African-American children and about or over a fifth of Latino children are in single mother households. Okay, so it is in fact the case that prevalences are much higher amongst those groups. Animate one further. It is also important to note that the penalties vary by racial and ethnic groups. So just like Jenny, as well as Christina Cross and others have shown, the penalty for single motherhood amongst African Americans is smaller than it is amongst whites, but the penalty amongst Latinos is bigger, okay? And we could debate whether that's gonna change the results. And you can animate a couple further and say that the model doesn't predict the near the actual levels of child poverty. And what you see there, and this is really worth underlining, the poverty rates amongst children, African-American and Latino children, are over a third of children, or roughly a third of children. And these rates of child poverty need to be emphasized because these rates of child poverty are unprecedented in modern rich democracies. No country in the history of recorded data has child poverty rates like African Americans and Latinos in the United States. These are astronomical. They're off the charts, okay? And so if you animate a bit further, if those populations reduced their single motherhood prevalences to the 1970 prevalence for all Americans, not just for African Americans, Latino, for all Americans, what you see is a couple of things. First of all, there'd only be very, very small reductions in child poverty. So even if African Americans, Latinos looked like the typical American household in 1970, you'd still have almost a third of those children in poverty. Moreover, even white children would have rates of child poverty above the cross-national mean. Now, animate just a bit further, same thing applies to cross-national medians. And again, if there was single motherhood. So there's a couple ways to look at this. If you look at white children with zero single motherhood, you basically get to the cross-national mean of child poverty. So only way the US can get to the cross-national mean of child poverty is only for white kids with zero single motherhood. By contrast, for African Americans and Latinos, you're still looking at approximately 32% of those kids in poverty, even with zero single motherhood in those communities. And this is stunning. This basically tells you, like, if Black and Latino children have no single motherhood, you still get rates of child poverty that are astronomically off the charts, okay? So now let's go a slide further. And like I mentioned, one of the concerns could be that we're not addressing post-treatment control carefully. Okay, so let me just sort of set this up. And I wanna thank Pablo and Felix Elward who gave us some help on these DAGs. I don't think Pablo is here, but I do wanna give him a shout out because he helped me out on this. And interestingly, via Twitter, by the way, it started through Twitter. Okay, so some may argue that other risks mediate the effect of single motherhood on child poverty. And thus we might conceal some of the single motherhood penalty. Perhaps most plausible is employment, okay, which if we're controlling for employment, would block the causal pathway of single motherhood. And if single motherhood penalty is truly much larger, we might have underestimated the effects of those lower prevalences, right? Now, here is a DAG that basically we're using. We're assuming that there are some sort of unobserved characteristics that probably matter to poverty, and we'll just use as a placeholder childhood disadvantage, right? There's stuff that predicts child poverty that when the parents themselves were kids might predict poverty, right? So that's possible. And we're hoping that by controlling for these four major risks, as well as the controls, we're blocking the causal pathway for that unobserved variable. If you believe in our DAG, we can identify the effect of single motherhood, okay? But if we're wrong and that single motherhood causes unemployment, we would conceal part of that effect. So let's go a slide further and tell you why we don't think this is the problem, okay? First of all, it's important to recognize that any effect of single motherhood on employment is likely to be quite small. And the reason is that the average child in America in single mother households has 1.2 earners in their household. This is the average single mother child. 87% of children in single mother families have at least one earner. And if you think about recent American history, one thing we've done is forced single mothers to work. There's very little welfare assistance available if you don't work. And so the overall majority of single mother households are employed single mother households. So you probably can't move the needle very much on employment through single mother because most single mothers do work. The overall majority work. Secondly, and I want to explain, is if we were to remove the employment coefficients, let's think about what we're doing. Well, we're taking out employment, which is the most important predictor of poverty. Okay, so you're omitting the most important predictor of poverty, and this would certainly trigger unobserved confounding and omitted variable bias. Okay, and you can see this with the DAG here using DAGity, is that if you take out multiple earners and unemployed as predictors in the model, you're going to have massive omitted variable bias because those variables still do matter and they're just going to be working their way through even if it's just through childhood disadvantage. Okay, so employment being the most important predictor, even if we attenuated the concern with post-treatment bias, we would be triggering a much bigger problem of omitted variable bias and unobserved confounding. Okay, so there's a trade-off here, right? So if you're worried about post-treatment control, the only way to address that, we think, is to control for employment. Or excuse me, if you're worried about post-treatment control, what you would do is omit some of those post-treatment controls from the model, but that then would trigger massive unobserved confounding, okay? Now, moreover, if we're really worried that single motherhood causes other risks, and those risks cause poverty, well, let's also open the Pandora's box and say, well, single motherhood is probably mediating another risk. I mean, Jenny and many others have shown that low education and employment causes single motherhood, right? And the whole point of the diverging destinies hypothesis was to say that single mothers are adversely selected based on social class. And if so, it's equally plausible, it's an equally strong assumption to not deal with the post-treatment control that single motherhood blocks the education or the employment coefficients, right? And if so, then it's sort of unfair just to address post-treatment control on single motherhood, but not on the other variables, okay? So our argument is that addressing post-treatment control, fixing that would be sort of like burning down the house because you have a leaky kitchen sink, is my metaphor there, okay? And nevertheless, let's go forward empirically and see if it changes the story, okay? So let's go forward one slide. And what we do here now is we say, okay, let's re-estimate the model with different assumptions. First, we say, what if we include no other independent variables except single motherhood? So we're saying our DAG is basically that the only predictor of poverty is single motherhood, okay? And that's got to be the upper bound. I can't prove it, but my hunch is that's the upper bound of what the penalty might be. And that's a purely unconditional estimate of the penalty in single motherhood. And you can see in the second column that, of course, the penalty is 3 times bigger. If single motherhood is the only predictor of child poverty, of course, you're going to get the impression that single motherhood has a much bigger effect on poverty. Then we also say, what if we omit education, employment, and age, which are the other variables that are plausibly endogenous to single motherhood, and then we can estimate the penalty. So we include a couple controls, but not the ones that are plausibly endogenous. Okay, so you can animate a little bit further, and you can see at the bottom, just go a little bit further, thank you, Esmeralda, is that even if we took these upper bound estimates of the penalties, even if we took something very close to unconditional penalties, you're still only going to reduce child poverty to about 15%. If you have 0 single motherhood. The US would still be far above the cross-national average on child poverty. And so again, the US would continue to have really high child poverty, even if there was no single motherhood, and even if you took what I would argue are these inflated estimates of penalties that are plausibly upper bound estimates of the penalties. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. All right, so now let me just conclude and then hopefully have a bit more time for Q&A in this crazy phone-based talk, the only talk I've ever given by phone, okay? Hopefully the last two. And just as a humorous side note, I mean, literally my Wi-Fi completely died. I have no Wi-Fi at all at my household, so I don't know what happened. This is new. Okay, anyway, so let me just say, okay, so first of all, I would point to a number of limitations of prior studies. They use the OPM. I think you should never use the OPM. They studied the 1980s, which I would argue is an earlier and unrepresentative time period. That's when the prevalence and the penalty for single motherhood was peaking. Okay. Moreover, all of these estimates we saw in prior studies use unconditional penalties. We argue penalties should be estimated conditional. Okay. Now, some of the descriptive patterns that we tried to show you, I tried to demonstrate that in a very simple way. The descriptive patterns do not, single motherhood cannot explain America's high child poverty. The US does have a fairly high prevalence of single motherhood, but that high prevalence is not untypical. It's very common. Moreover, single motherhood still has the smallest penalty of the 4 risks. Now, beyond that, our counterfactual simulations show that reducing single motherhood would not substantially reduce child poverty. Even if you had 0 single motherhood, the US would only move from having the 3rd highest child poverty to the 4th highest child poverty. And it would only decline very, very modestly. Now, further, I'd add that the US has systematically high poverty for all families. It's not just single mother households that have high poverty, even our couple households, and even if we had no single mothers, we would still have high child poverty in the United States. And this is a problem of the systematic quality of high poverty in the United States, not a problem of single mothers. Moreover, I would note that regardless of single motherhood, literally regardless of single motherhood, Black and Latino children have rates of child poverty that are off the charts. And that's regardless of single motherhood. So even in coupled households and Black and Latino families, you have child poverty rates that are far above cross-national averages. And even if you had 0 prevalences on all 4 of the risks, even if the US had no people at risk of child poverty, you would still predict 13.4% of our children to be poor, which is above the cross-national average. And so our argument is that poverty is a systemic problem of every type of household in America, for children. And it's not simply a story of the prevalence of single motherhood. Finally, last but not least, I would argue this endorses political theories over behavioral theories of poverty, because the goal needs to be to reduce penalties and reduce the systemic quality of poverty in America rather than reducing the prevalence of risk. And I'll stop there and take Q&A with the remaining time. And again, I'm so sorry, guys. I don't know what is going on. This is the ultimate meltdown. And thank you so much for your patience. And, you know, I don't know. I don't know what else it was, but thank you for whatever you did to tolerate me today. So now I can be like a cautionary tale to the grad students. Like, you saw a talk where the whole system broke down, and I tried to survive on my phone. Hopefully it was okay.
You survived very well, so stop.
Thank you, Don. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Brady. I see a hand raised.
Go ahead.
Dr. Hiveli?
Yes, hi. Thank you for, this is Patrick Uvelin. Thank you for the presentation in spite of the challenging circumstances. And I apologize because I also had to I was logged out and I had to log back in. So I might have missed, I missed about 5 minutes of your presentation. You might have said that earlier. On your last point, I think the dichotomy between political and behavioral ways of addressing child poverty in the US, if I understand correctly, lies on your distinction between the penalty and the prevalence of single motherhood. So the part I missed, and I want to make sure I had this correctly, is I think you're looking at you're not looking at cohabitation. You're looking at being married with a married parent or with a non-married mother, and this is a big difference, especially in international comparison, in that a lot of children who are growing up with a single mother in Sweden are actually living with two parents. So you may, so what is the part of the penalty of living with this? Part of the penalty
so we
of living with a single mother
really
in the US?
Patrick. Yeah, so Patrick, just like your demography paper, we treat cohabitors as married. So we treat cohabitors as partnered. We should call them partnered, not unmarried. And the reason, as you probably know from your own analyses with the list, is that in Europe, it's difficult to distinguish between long-term cohabiting couples versus current, short-term cohabiting couples. And so we treat all cohabitors as partnered. Okay, so there's that. So single mothers are only unpartnered. Okay, that are all unpartnered. Now, that said, of course, in census data, there could be people living with men or other adults that are in some de facto way partnered, but are not classified as partners. Of course, that's possible. But you can imagine that we treat them as partnered. If we moved the cohabitors into the single mother group in some way or in some part, this would attenuate the single motherhood penalty, right? Because it would shift relatively more advantaged mothers into the penalty group, the risk group, right? And that would then drive down your coefficient. So our estimate is plausibly a higher end estimate of that penalty. Sorry for the rambling.
No, that answers my question.
Yeah, and I'm going to say out loud the other ways we thought about this issue, because I had that ready in Q&A, and I know that Don asked me about that early on. And you could think about other ways you might attack this, and we really thought a lot about this on how it might be better to do so. So one thing we did was we did lone mothers, and we redid the analysis. And the prevalence does decline and the penalty does decline, but the story doesn't change, okay? We also came up with like a slightly different way, just digging in the weeds of the list classifications and said, okay, let's find unpartnered and uncoupled single mothers, which somehow would be different than our other measure. And the prevalence would be like 19.6 instead of 20.0. So we could fiddle with the margins of the measurement of single motherhood. And again, the story doesn't change. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons that we put the code in with the paper is that, it's actually not 100% clear how to code single mothers. As much as we think it is, there's actually a little bit of subjectivity to how you classify some of these things. And we have a comment forthcoming at AJS about this issue. And I'll defend this approach. I think this approach is a good approach. Other questions?
Oh, I have a question if I can. The racial disparities you show were really dramatic in terms of poverty. And so I'm wondering, you know, how much of the racial disadvantages in the US can explain the high child poverty? Or can you imagine what kind of counterfactual could you do, assuming that, the disadvantage of being Black or Latino, if you replace those with white or
it's a tricky counterfactual, obviously. I mean, I recognize that you're saying that with trepidation. Like you could think through net of all of these observable characteristics. There is a penalty for being African-American Latino. It's about 6% net of all these other variables. So African-American Latino children are about 6 percentage points more likely to be poor than white children. So race does matter net of these characteristics. And this comes back to a point that Jenny smartly, astutely raised, is that, you know, we could dig into compounding risks and see if that changed our story a little bit. It's tricky. And I can't remember the full story of why we backed off that question at some point earlier in this project. If Regina is still here, if her patience has not been exhausted, maybe she remembers why did we give up on compounding risk? So maybe the story would be a little different if we think about compounding risk, because you could plausibly conjecture that African-American Latino children have more compounding risks, right? And I can't remember why we didn't dig into that in this paper. One final thing that I could do, that I can talk about, is in an appendix in the paper. One of the things we do is we say, well, in the US data since 2000, you can also identify non-citizen and immigrant children, okay? So our children where the head is not a citizen or not an immigrant. And then you could say, well, what if we control for that? Well, first of all, it doesn't really change the story on Latinos, okay? But of course it matters, right? Of course it matters. And so we could get into that. We do in the appendix just to make sure like the fundamental story doesn't change radically about single motherhood, but it does matter. I mean, don't get me wrong, being in an undocumented household greatly increases your probability of poverty. So we can talk about that a little bit. I just sort of read that to you. So like if you control for immigrant head or non-citizen head, two different binary indicators, the penalty for single motherhood goes from 9.5, or it goes from 12.8 for Latinos to 13.9. So it increases a bit, but as you can imagine, the counterfactuals don't really change as a result of that. Yeah, but there's a lot to do. I mean, I think that it's sort of a tricky, thought. I have sort of a counterintuitive thought about this is like, you're trying to explain non-variation. We're trying to explain this systemically and persistently high poverty of African-American Latino children, regardless of family structure, regardless of any observable, okay? And again, that's setting aside compounding risks, which could be a plausible hypothesis. It just tells you that you're trying to say like, why have African-American and Latino children always been far more likely to be poor when you don't really have variation? There's no, it's like the old line in the classic book, Blaming the Victim, one of my favorite books. And he says, we've never run the experiment on race. We've had plenty of the treatment condition, but we don't have the control condition for racism, right? We never have a non-racism time in American history. So we don't know what the control condition or the treatment effect really is. Sorry, maybe that was more rambling than you anticipated, Andreas, with your question.
Thank you, that was good.
Can I ask one, so I'm fully on board with thinking about this as, that single motherhood is not the main cause of poverty. And in the work we did on divorce, that we didn't see any effect of divorce among those who were, had a high likelihood of divorce, or among Black children. So, but a lot of that was because there's so many other adverse things going on in childhood that, it wasn't the particular cause of single motherhood or of divorce or one of these particular events that really led to it. It's just like we're saying, there's multiple things going on that are leading to kind of lower levels of well-being. And so I'm just kind of wondering, it's hard to think of these counterfactuals of if you had lower levels of single motherhood, what other things kind of shift in the sphere, and then also just heterogeneity in terms of, so for the people who are unlikely to be single mothers or who don't have all these other, adverse experiences, then maybe it's more consequential, and you see these larger effects among those who don't have, all these other circumstances that are leading to lower levels of well-being. So this isn't really a question, more just like kind of.
But I think about the same things, Jenny. I think totally about the same things. I mean, and I like, you articulated better than I could have, but I think about it similarly. I mean, I think like children are facing a whole variety of disadvantages. But I mean, one way I think about it is that like, I'd like to claim that the literature has certainly not been that nuanced and modest about the effects of single motherhood. So I would politely say, like, these folks, we quoted them verbatim at the beginning because sometimes we get told nobody believes this. And I'm like, they write that very deliberately. So they've had very strong, and I use the word cause very explicitly because they say cause. And so I hope you would agree that, like, even if you and I agree there's all this nuance and we should be modest about what we can learn here, I would say, well, they're certainly not modest and nuanced about the damage they think single motherhood is doing, right? I mean, like, those quotes by Elwood and Jenks are just unambiguous. They're absolutely certain of this. And so I still believe that the field still feels single motherhood is a powerful cause. Okay, so, and partly, you get into this game in the business where you're fighting, you're tilting at windmills a little bit, but these arguments are out there. Okay, so there's that. Second, I would say, like, the policy intervention implies a pretty simplistic take, right? Because we want to induce and encourage marriage or discourage single motherhood. So in that simplistic policy world, this is still the right question. But I'm with you to say that, like, do I believe that this is the complete model of child poverty? No. And we could do something more rigorous with the PSID, and in the future, we'd like to do so, but we just kind of wanted to take it on directly this way for this particular paper. Does that answer your question, Jenny?
Yeah, if there was a question in there that.
I mean, but a good question would be, to Jenny's point, I see a question as like, so like, what would be the optimal way to really causally model child poverty? If we're not, like, here, I'm like, I hope fairly we're testing them on their turf and taking their claims at face value and doing very simple analyses that show, even with simple comparisons, you can't get from there to here. Okay, but I think a better question would be like, what's the optimal way to model child poverty? And that's a harder question.
There's also just this interesting association between the prevalence and the penalties where, if there are higher penalties, you'd almost expect some lower prevalence, and yet kind of see as much. And, Florencia just came out with some paper about the normativity of single parenthood and how that influences the experience and, how it impacts health, I think was the outcome there. But that how normative is an environment, and then the penalties associated with that. So totally agree. Yeah, so Florencia's paper, I'm a big fan of that paper. I think she's totally right. In the 2017 paper, we just do very simple descriptive correlation. We do very descriptive correlations between prevalence and penalties, and you would expect that higher penalties would reduce prevalences, because that's the definition of a disincentive, right? If you know that you choose to be a single mother household, or you live in a society where single mothers are severely penalized, there should be less of them, right? And we show like that doesn't pan out at all. And whereas that's of course not a causal test of disincentives, it's prima facie evidence that there's other countervailing forces. And so it's not at all the case that countries with high penalties have lower prevalences. The US is a perfect example. We have both. And the correlation between prevalences and penalties in the country level is like 0.0. It's 0.0 basically. And so, yeah, I completely agree. I agree completely. You're preaching to the choir. And Florencia's paper, I feel, yes, absolutely. That's a great paper.
Yeah, but I thought it was interesting. It was validating when we did the racial decomposition that, like, we found, just like you and Christina Cross and others, that the penalties are much smaller for African-American children. And our culture and our politics are obsessed with regulating Black single mothers, when in fact the returns to marriage are much weaker for Black single mothers than other racial and ethnic groups. So that was sort of validating.
Great. I think we're basically out of time.
Okay.
So thank you very much for a wonderful presentation, and despite the difficulties you had. And I think if you stick around, and all the students stick around for the pro seminar, you just stay in this, anybody interested in the students, just stay in the Zoom link, and you can join David. Thank you again.
Again, my apologies for the tech difficulties. You guys were very gracious and kind with my rather inept tech setup, which of course fails today. I swear I've been teaching this way all year, and of course today it melts down. So I don't know, some sort of karma.
Bye.
Okay. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Don.
All right, perfect. So I see we have more students than those that emailed me, which is fine. You all can stay. I'm going to go ahead and just, I believe you're a co-host, but let me double check that. Okay, perfect. So I went ahead and made you a co-host, and I'm going to go ahead and hop off. But
okay, bye, Esmeralda.
All right. Yeah, absolutely. Great presentation.
Okay, thank you, Esmeralda.
Take care. Thank you.
Okay.